at the inquiry, he didn't have a bank account. I mean, the Taoiseach of Ireland didn't have a bank account, and these people, they sold the electricity grid to foreign funds. We had the cheapest electricity in Europe, and now we have the dearest.
Mm.
And then Simon Harris says last night, when he's confronted with the facts about, 69,000 of our young people emigrating last year, and many of them going to Australia, he said, I'm going to get them all back from Australia.
He's going to go and get them back himself. Yeah. Count them all out.
Do you know what? Like, I did think there were fascinating insights. So, none more than whenever Mary Lou MacDonald said, well, you brought in austerity to Harris. And he said, that wasn't me, that was Enda Kenny. It's just what? I mean, just fuck, throw him under the bus. The utter disloyalty of it. And it was an absolute trick. Well, he said, that wasn't me, that was Enda Kenny. And I mean, you just think about that sort of self-serving, fucking don't be blaming us fucking that. If it wasn't for the mess we had inherited from that useless so-and-so Enda Kenny, the country would be absolutely flying.
Well, like all
house prices would be down, hospitals would be built, we'd have a terrific public transport system, teachers would be paid properly, we could afford rents. And everybody wouldn't be going to Australia. Bloody damn you, Enda Kenny, damn you.
Well, I think if whatever Simon Harris says, he will come out and say that he let himself down. He'll give the same. He'll say, nobody's more annoyed with myself than I am for that. He'll say a bit like, reminded me when he was saying that about his in interaction with the woman in Kanturk, as she has to be known. Charlotte Fallon, but he was saying, nobody more annoyed with me than myself. It was very like the brother, Damon Morrissey's portrayal of Flann O'Brien. When you end up in the cattle market pubs. Nobody more surprised than myself to find myself there, and that's the same with Harris. Nobody's more annoyed. He's just looking at how could I do that? How could this one moment, which has been pointed out, is kind of was just a spike of a succession of moments like that where he's got irritable, and this idea of him being this sort of huge electoral asset again. Like I was watching that debate last night, going like, where did they get this idea from? Only in a world where you don't actually, where people, most people don't pay attention to politics, but Irish people really, really don't pay attention to what passes for Irish politics most of the time, the discourse, the stuff that's happening. And I talked about this before. I remember being...
But we didn't really have an opposition until 2020.
But let me just finish this point, Joe. I was at the... when Leo Varadkar was going for leader in whatever year that was, and I mentioned last time about being at those debates, but he went... I remember going into the Red Cow for the first Fine Gael debate between himself and Simon Coveney, and talking to an old Fine Gael grandee, and he said, they love him in there, and he pointed into the room, which was packed full of people. Then he pointed out, like, to the direction of the kind of west of Ireland, out beyond the M50, and he said, and they love him out there too. Now, Leo, you like Leo. When I've met Leo, I liked him, but the idea that he had some kind of common touch was fantasy. It's the same with Simon Harris.
Oh, I mean, like the sort of the king, the pole topper in the West was, of course, Michael Ring, who's stepping down. I'm very fond of Michael, and he's great fun, and an old style Irish politician. I mean, who else would have managed to get a motorway from Castlebar to Westport? 22-mile motorway from Castlebar. You're like, what? It's like, what the fuck? And it's empty.
That's what the canvasser who said pictures were nothing to do with them should have paid attention to.
Correct. Yeah. And the two bypasses, the two big main bypasses through Mayo, which are absolutely chronic. I mean, they're not bypasses at all. I mean, one of them, the one that runs from Swinford down to sort of down towards Edgeworthstown, etc. I mean, there's nowhere to pass. There's not a single overtaking lane. And then the other bypass has one very small overtaking lane, the one that comes up from Galway. But there's Ringer, who has brought in a motorway, and who, would just think that Leo Varadkar was a completely alien species that would have absolutely no understanding of people in the West, Ringer, who once gave us a piece of advice, he gave the glamorous brunette a piece of advice when she was starting out as on this odyssey to raise the funds for the two state-of-the-art hospices in Roscommon and Mayo. He says, I'll give you a piece of advice. He says, never stand on the edge of the photograph. She'll be the first one cut out. So if you notice the Ringer, he's always right in the middle. He also gave another very interesting piece of advice. He says, when you go to a wake or a funeral, right, be the first one or the last one. Never go in the middle because nobody remembers.
Very good, very good.
But the idea that himself and Leo, for example, would have anything in common would be ridiculous. I mean, Leo wouldn't be able to handle himself at all around Mayo, around the games, around the clubhouses, around all the sorts of things that make Mayo people tick and people in the West tick. But you mentioned the Simon Harris about the awkwardness and about the incident with the disabled carer. And it was interesting, he said, and it's a funny thing that, these parties who've been in power for so long, I think that in a way they were so shocked by what happened in 2020, which led obviously to them forming up, because essentially they're the same party. They work on behalf of the vested interests. The establishment, the banks. The wealthy, and there's an effortless sort of free flow between the two. But they now have sort of the rhetoric that they used to use, which we could all see if we fact checked it was false. It is very starkly, obviously false now. I mean, like, for example, he said last night, well, anyone who is disabled who wants a job can get one here. Now, that was, I looked at that this morning, and the CSO's own figures, Ireland ranks the lowest in the entire European Union for disability employment, 32.6%, which is a full 20% below the European Union average. The current coalition government, Dion, has given more to the greyhound racing industry than to the disabled community and carers in every single budget for the 5 years of their coalition. Now, you just let that sink in. The wealthy greyhound owners and operators have got more money in each of the last 5 budgets than the disabled community and carers. And also, it amazes me. Like, we just had a really high-profile care referendum. And as Dr. Robert Bohan, who's a fan of the podcast, I'm delighted to say, wrote this morning, do not forget that Simon Harris ran a care referendum that would have removed all state responsibility to support people with disabilities or to help carers. And the point being that the existence, the raison d'etre for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil is to look after the interests of the wealthy, which means that necessarily they punch down. The money goes to the top. It's protected. It goes to the big funds, the corporations, the banks. Proper disability and care system means different spending priorities. And that's what's so terrifying about Sinn Féin. But again, it seems to me that what we see now with Fine Gael, and I'm going to come back to something very striking that Emer Curry said this morning, and we're in Ireland, Austin's daughter, Austin, who was the SDLP man in the north, who let the side down very badly, if truth be told. But, the founder and first leader of Fine Gael, W.T. Cosgrove, said people reared in workhouses are no great acquisition to the community and have no idea whatever of civic responsibility. It would be a decided gain if they all took it into their heads to emigrate. Now, that was his philosophy. And is it not interesting that is precisely what our young people are doing in their droves? 69,000 of them last year alone. And Simon Harris says in the debate last night, don't worry. I intend to get them all back. do you know how he intends to get them all back?
I don't know how. No, I would say that people are emigrating less than they did 30 years ago.
69,000 last year.
You know how
young
many came
people.
back?
And you look at the most recent statistics set out by Rory Hearn and by various housing bodies, that home ownership in the 18 to 30-year-old bracket has collapsed. That the average age of people buying a home now, a first home, is 39. And, you know, so many of our young people are resigned now. If they are going to stay at home, in mostly lower paid jobs, they're resigned to living with their parents and then hopefully inheriting a house from their parents, you know. And
30,000 Irish people returned to Ireland in the last year and 34,000 left. So it's not like it was in the 80s.
What you find is, well, I mean, it shouldn't be. We're very wealthy. We're very, as both Simon Harris and not Andy Kenny, he was a disaster. As both Simon and, you know, if it hadn't been for Andy Kenny, he should be ashamed of himself. Fair play to Simon for somebody had to say it.
He's only been in the job 7 months. I like that bit too. That was good. You know, he's only Simon, don't blame someone else if you don't like what you've seen around here.
Exactly. But Simon and Mayhall, you know, I thought very interesting watching them. And I thought that I couldn't help thinking all the time as I was watching them, I would love to cross-examine them, because I'm absolutely certain that they got together before that debate last night and said, look, we can't appear to be singing from the same hymn sheet all the time. We're going to have to be polite to each other, obviously, but we're going to have to be nuanced with this, because one thing we cannot be seen to be is sort of, you know, twin brothers in terms of political philosophy. You know, we have to look as though we're saying. But for me, the most interesting thing was when Simon Harris got into the IRAing.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, well, I will not take lectures on law and order from a party that have murdered guards and that whose TDs have picked up Garda murderers outside prison. See? And the fascinating thing for me was that was virtually identical to what Micheál Martin said in the 10-leader debate last week. And I have no doubt that they said, look, I better not do the IRN this time. You do the IRN, because there's a certain old rump that enjoys that. And let's get that in when she starts talking about how the guards have been decimated, you know, how 99% of the rank and file guard voted no confidence in the Garda commissioner after the riots. And yet Helen McEntee, you know, stood by the Garda commissioner in spite of his extremely dubious past. And it is interesting that almost every Fine Gaeler or Fianna Fáiler who is interviewed now is IRAing again. I mean, Heather Humphreys, she is an expert IRAer, an inveterate IRAer. I don't know if you saw this morning, she was IRAing again. And this was her tweet. And I thought about what we discussed, Dion, a few podcasts ago about Jean McConville's son, talking about how horrific and cruel it was that his mother's name would be used, you know, by people with agendas, you know, to further their own sort of cause. This is what Heather tweeted today. On the same day, the possible remains of one of the disappeared victims is exhumed from the cold ground in Monaghan. Mary Lou MacDonald will not rule out attending the funerals of IRA murderers. You know, and the person that she was referring to was Joe Linsky, who was abducted and it appears tortured and then buried. That happened 52 years ago in 1972. I looked up Mary Lou's date of birth. She had just turned 3 years old at the time.